Ontario has a working salt mine 1,800 feet beneath Lake Huron. It has a 106 square kilometer lake sitting on an island that itself sits inside another lake. And nearly 3 kilometers underground, researchers found water that may have been isolated from the surface for around 2 billion years. All 3 are documented. We went through the figures, the government records, and the scientific research behind this list, then ranked the facts by one standard: how wrong they sound before you see the evidence. If verified geography that refuses to behave the way maps taught us is your kind of subject, subscribe. Here are 50 facts about Ontario that seem fake. None of them are. Fact 50. Ontario has 2 times. Ontario does not operate on one time zone. Most of the province uses Eastern Time, which makes sense if your mental picture of Ontario is Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, and the populated South. But move far enough west and the clock changes. Federal time authorities place the division at roughly 90 degrees west longitude. Parts of northwestern Ontario operate on Central Time, 1 hour behind Toronto. The province is wide enough that 2 Ontarians can live under different official clocks without crossing a provincial border. Fact 49. 250,000 lakes. Ontario has more than 250,000 lakes. Not ponds counted by an enthusiastic tourism department. Lakes. Glaciers repeatedly scraped and fractured the Canadian Shield, leaving depressions, blocked drainage systems, and water-filled basins across enormous sections of the province. Most never appear on the maps people normally use, because many are tiny, remote, or surrounded by wilderness. So when someone says Ontario is lake country, the scale is not rhetorical. The official count starts above 250,000. Fact 48. Bigger than 2 countries. Ontario is larger than France and Spain combined. Statistics Canada puts the province's total area at 1,076,395 square kilometers. Ontario looks manageable on a map, mainly because Canada surrounding it is even larger. The populated southern strip does most of the cultural work, while the province continues hundreds of kilometers north toward Hudson Bay. France and Spain feel like major pieces of Europe. Put their areas together, and Ontario still covers more ground. That is the scale people routinely underestimate. Fact 47. A 670-meter wide falls. Niagara Falls is not remarkable because Horseshoe Falls is exceptionally tall. It is remarkable because it is exceptionally wide. The Canadian Horseshoe Falls drops about 57 meters, but its curved crest stretches roughly 670 meters from side to side. That is more than half a kilometer of falling water wrapped around a giant arc. Photographs flatten that geometry, so the eye tends to notice height first. In reality, much of Niagara's physical presence comes from width. The 670-meter figure is the part photographs struggle to explain. Fact 46. 14 kilometers of beach. Ontario has a freshwater beach extending for more than 14 kilometers. Wasaga Beach sits on Georgian Bay, not an ocean, yet provincial and municipal authorities describe it as the world's longest freshwater beach. The sand exists because waves, currents, and glacial sediments built an unusually long and continuous shoreline system. 14 kilometers means you could begin walking along the sand and continue for hours without leaving the same freshwater beach environment. Ocean-scale scenery. No salt required. Fact 45. A 202-kilometer machine. Ontario has a transportation system opened in 1832 that still works along a 202-kilometer route. The Rideau Canal links Ottawa and Kingston through rivers, lakes, channels, dams, and locks. Channels. This is not simply a preserved line on a historic map. Boats still travel it, and many locks continue operating with heritage-era mechanisms. UNESCO recognized the canal because so much of the original engineering system survives. A machine can apparently be 202 kilometers long and almost 2 centuries old. Fact 44. 2,000 canoe kilometers. Inside one Ontario provincial park is a canoe network longer than many national road journeys. Algonquin Provincial Park contains more than 2,000 kilometers of canoe routes. Its lakes and rivers connect through channels and portages, allowing paddlers to travel for days while remaining inside the park. That number changes the scale of Algonquin completely. It is not merely a cluster of campsites around a few lakes. 2,000 kilometers is a transportation network. The vehicles just happen to be canoes. Fact 43. Ontario has true wilderness. Ontario contains a national park covering 1,878 square kilometers that Parks Canada describes as the province's only wilderness national park. Pukaskwa sits on Lake Superior's north shore, where Canadian shield rock, boreal forest, and exposed coastlines stretch far beyond road access. Much of the park is backcountry. That matters because southern Ontario can make the entire province feel densely connected by highways and cities. Pukaskwa is the reminder that Ontario still contains landscapes where the road network simply stops. Fact 42. A park grew sixfold. Wabakimi Provincial Park did not simply become slightly larger in 1997. It went from about 155,000 hectares to roughly 892,000 hectares. More than 737,000 hectares were added in one expansion, taking the park to almost 5.8 times its former size. Later boundary measurements differ slightly, but the transformation itself is clear. Most parks grow through additions around the edges. Wabakimi effectively changed geographic category, becoming a vast protected boreal landscape almost at once. Fact 41. Ontario's inland giant. Ontario has a lake covering 4,848 square kilometers that many people outside northern Ontario rarely hear about. Lake Nipigon is the largest lake lying entirely within the province. It drains south through the Nipigon River into Lake Superior, which helps explain why it disappears psychologically beside its enormous neighbor. But 4,848 square kilometers is not a minor lake. It is a body of water almost 5,000 square kilometers in area that never crosses a provincial or international boundary. Fact 40. Ontario's 40-meter drop. Niagara is not Ontario's only waterfall operating at serious scale. Kakabeka Falls, west of Thunder Bay, drops approximately 40 meters and is identified by provincial sources as Ontario's second highest waterfall. The Kaministiquia River cuts through ancient rock and sediment before entering the gorge below. Its problem is publicity. Niagara occupies so much space in the idea of an Ontario waterfall that Kakabeka can feel small by comparison. 40 meters of vertical river says otherwise. Fact 39. A 725-kilometer escarpment. The Niagara Escarpment is not just the cliff behind Niagara Falls. The escarpment corridor extends for approximately 725 kilometers through Ontario. It runs from the Niagara region northwest through southern Ontario and toward the Bruce Peninsula, creating cliffs, forest systems, and exposed carbonate rock along the way. The name encourages people to imagine one local landform. The actual feature is province scale. 725 kilometers is not scenery beside Niagara. It is a geological backbone. Fact 38. A 165,621 square meter rink. Ottawa sometimes turns part of a working canal into a 7.8 kilometer skating rink. When winter conditions cooperate, the Rideau Canal Skateway covers about 165,621 square meters of maintained ice. Guinness has recognized that surface as the largest naturally frozen skating rink. The distinction is important. This is not just people wandering onto a frozen river. The surface is monitored, maintained, swept, and operated as a skating facility. A commute-length piece of a canal becomes recreational infrastructure. Fact 37. A 23,552 square kilometer park. Ontario's largest provincial park covers 23,552 square kilometers. Polar Bear Provincial Park occupies a huge section of Hudson Bay coastline, wetlands, and tundra in the province's far north. There are no ordinary road access campgrounds waiting at the entrance. The remoteness is part of the point. 23,552 square kilometers is larger than many protected areas people think of as enormous. Ontario's largest park is also one of the places most Ontarians will never physically enter. Fact 36. A 40-kilometer sand spit. Long Point reaches roughly 40 kilometers into Lake Erie, and it is not a bedrock peninsula. It is an enormous erosion and deposition feature built from sediment moved by water. UNESCO describes Long Point as the largest formation of its kind in the Great Lakes. Currents shift sand along the shoreline and continuously reshape the spit, meaning the landscape that looks permanent from the air is actually a moving geological system. 40 kilometers of land assembled by lake processes. Fact 35. 900 stone images. One Ontario rock surface contains roughly 900 mapped Indigenous petroglyphs. At Petroglyphs Provincial Park, a formal survey recorded 900 glyphs across about 232 square meters. The carvings include human forms, animals, symbolic figures, and other designs, cut directly into exposed marble. The concentration is the difficult part to picture. 900 carvings sounds like the inventory of an archaeological district. Here they occupy one sacred rock site. The number came from mapping the surface itself. Fact 34. 260 paintings on cliffs. Ontario also has more than 260 Indigenous pictographs spread along roughly 2.5 kilometers of cliff. They are at Mazinaw Rock, above Mazinaw Lake. Many were painted in red ochre on surfaces most naturally approached from the water. Parks Canada identifies Mazinaw as the largest rock art site on the southern Canadian Shield. So a person paddling along one Ontario lake can pass kilometers of cliff carrying hundreds of painted images. The landscape itself functions as the gallery wall. Fact 33. 244,160 square kilometers. The 5 Great Lakes cover about 244,160 square kilometers. They are called lakes, which makes that number harder to process than it should be. 4 of the 5 touch Ontario, and from their shores, the horizon can disappear, exactly as it does beside an ocean. Storm systems cross them. Commercial ships cross them. Entire national economies depend on them. 250,000 square kilometers of freshwater surface is large enough that ordinary language begins to undersell what the Great Lakes actually are. Fact 32. 17,017 kilometers of shore. The Great Lakes have roughly 17,017 kilometers of shoreline under the standard government measurement that includes islands. That is why measuring these lakes by a simple outline produces misleading intuition. Bays, islands, peninsulas, channels, and irregular coasts multiply the distance dramatically. Ontario touches 4 lakes within that system. The strange part is not that the shoreline is long. It is that freshwater geography can generate a coastline figure normally associated with countries. 17,000 kilometers does that. Fact 31. Huron beats Superior on shoreline. Lake Superior is larger than Lake Huron by surface area. Lake Huron still has the longer measured shoreline. Government tables put Huron at roughly 6,157 kilometers and Superior at about 4,385 kilometers. That makes Huron's shoreline around 40% longer. Georgian Bay, the North Channel, Manitoulin, islands, and countless inlets make Huron geometrically complicated. Area and shoreline are not the same contest. Superior wins one. Huron wins the other. Fact 30. Superior drops 406 meters. Lake Superior reaches approximately 406 meters at its deepest point. 406 meters for a freshwater lake. Its basin was shaped by ancient geology and later glacial erosion, producing a depth that behaves more like something people instinctively associate with ocean water. The surface sits about 183 meters above sea level, which creates another problem we will come back to later. For now, the important figure is simple. From surface to deepest floor, Superior drops more than 400 meters. Fact 29. Arctic plants near Thunder Bay. Near Thunder Bay, you can stand above a canyon where plants grow roughly 1,000 kilometers south of where you would normally expect them. Ouimet Canyon is about 150 meters wide, with cliffs around 100 meters deep. Cold air sinks into fractured rock and remains trapped near the bottom, creating a localized climate far colder than the surrounding region. That microclimate supports northern vegetation well outside its usual range. The canyon effectively moves Arctic conditions south without moving the plants. Fact 28. Superior beats New Brunswick. Lake Superior covers more area than the entire province of New Brunswick. Superior's surface area is about 82,100 square kilometers. Statistics Canada lists New Brunswick at 72,908. The difference is 9,192 square kilometers. That comparison feels wrong because maps teach us to treat a province as land territory and a lake as a feature inside territory. Scale does not care about the category. One lake touching Ontario covers more surface than an entire Canadian province. Fact 27. A 60 by 30 impact scar. The modern Sudbury impact structure is roughly 60 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. Those dimensions describe the surviving deformed structure of an impact that occurred about 1.85 billion years ago. The original feature was larger and more circular, but tectonic forces and erosion transformed what remained. 60 by 30 kilometers is the scale of a metropolitan region. In Sudbury, those dimensions are part of the geological footprint left by a collision from space. And that collision gets stranger later. Fact 26. Smallest yet second deepest. Lake Ontario is the smallest Great Lake by surface area. It is also the second deepest. Its area is about 18,960 square kilometers, but its maximum depth reaches 244 meters. Only Lake Superior, at about 406 meters, goes deeper. The contradiction disappears once you separate surface footprint from basin shape. A lake can occupy less map space and still plunge much farther downward. Lake Ontario is smaller than every other Great Lake across the surface, then quietly outranks 3 of them in depth. Fact 25. Smaller lake, triple water. Lake Erie covers more surface area than Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario contains about 3.39 times as much water. Official measurements give Ontario roughly 1,640 cubic kilometers of water and Erie only 484. The reason is depth. Erie averages around 19 meters deep. Ontario averages roughly 86 meters. So the lake that looks smaller on a flat map holds more than triple the volume. Both things are true. Which of these has been the hardest to accept so far? Tell us in the comments, and tell us if you already knew any of them. The first half was the easier half. From here, the numbers become less cooperative. Fact 24. Nearly 4 times deeper. Lake Ontario and Lake Erie sit next to each other in the same Great Lakes chain. One reaches almost 4 times deeper than the other. Ontario's maximum depth is 244 meters. Erie's is 64. Divide the two, and Ontario is about 3.81 times deeper, Nothing on a normal road map communicates that difference. One blue shape simply connects to another blue shape. Under the surface, they are dramatically different basins, and Erie is the shallowest Great Lake of all. Fact 23. Superior holds 12,100 cubic kilometers. Lake Superior alone contains approximately 12,100 cubic kilometers of water. That is not the volume of the Great Lakes system. That is Superior by itself. It combines the system's largest surface area with its greatest depth, giving it a volume that overwhelms the other lakes. In fact, using the same government measurements, Superior contains more water than Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario combined. One lake holds more than the other four put together. Fact 22. Erie turns over in 2.6 years. Lake Erie is enormous, yet its estimated water retention time is only about 2.6 years. That does not mean every drop remains for exactly 2.6 years. It is a basin-wide estimate of how long water takes to move through the system. Erie is broad but shallow and holds about 484 cubic kilometers. Its water, therefore, cycles through much faster than in deeper lakes. The strange part only becomes obvious when you compare that figure with Lake Superior. We will. Ontario touches 78%. Ontario does not border Lake Michigan. Even so, the four Great Lakes it does touch contain about 78.3% of the total water volume in all five Great Lakes. Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario together hold approximately 17,764 cubic kilometers. The complete system holds about 22,684. Ontario misses an entire Great Lake and still touches the basins containing more than 3/4 of the system's water. Superior is doing a great deal of work in that calculation. Fact 20. 42% is far north. Ontario's legally defined far north covers roughly 42% of the province's landmass. Government reporting has placed the region at around 452,000 square kilometers. That area stretches from the Manitoba border across to James Bay in Quebec, encompassing boreal forest, wetlands, rivers, and extremely remote communities. The familiar Ontario of cities, highways, and farmland occupies the mental foreground. Almost half the province's land lies in a region most residents rarely see. That is a map problem, not a geography problem. Fact 19. 22,684 cubic kilometers. The Great Lakes collectively hold approximately 22,684 cubic kilometers of water. Surface maps hide this number because volume exists downward. Lake Erie contributes relatively little because it is shallow. Superior contributes an enormous amount because it is both wide and deep. Ontario sits beside four members of this freshwater system, which helps explain why these lakes produce ocean-like weather, shipping, horizons, and coastlines. Calling them lakes is correct. It just does very little to communicate their physical scale. Fact 18. Water stays 191 years. Lake Superior has an estimated water retention time of about 191 years. Erie was 2.6. Superior is 191. The lake constantly receives precipitation and river water and constantly loses water through its outlet. But its volume is so enormous compared with that flow that complete system turnover is exceptionally slow. That number is correct. A Great Lakes residence timetable measures Superior not in months and not even in decades, but on a timescale approaching 2 centuries. Fact 17. 73 times longer. Now put those two lakes beside each other. Lake Superior's estimated residence time is about 191 years. Lake Erie's is roughly 2.6. Divide one by the other and water remains in the Superior system about 73.5 times longer. On average, they belong to the same chain of lakes. Water ultimately flows from one end of the system toward the Atlantic, yet their internal timescales are separated by more than a factor of 70. Same Great Lakes, completely different clocks. Fact 16. One lake holds half. There are 5 Great Lakes. One of them contains more than half their combined water. Lake Superior holds roughly 12,100 cubic kilometers out of a 5-lake total of about 22,684. If the Great Lakes water were divided into 2 equal portions, Superior alone would still take the larger share. The other 4 lakes, despite everything visible on the map, share what remains. The word superior was not chosen for this statistic, but it fits unusually well. Fact 15. Ontario's lake floor is subsea. Lake Ontario is freshwater inland, and its surface sits about 74 meters above sea level. Its deepest floor lies roughly 170 meters below sea level. The arithmetic is straightforward. Maximum depth is about 244 meters. Start 74 meters above sea level and descend 244. You end at approximately minus 170. Nothing is contradictory here. A lake basin can simply extend below the elevation of the ocean. It only sounds wrong because we rarely imagine inland lakes vertically. Fact 14. Superior goes 223 meters below. Lake Superior takes the same trick even farther. Its surface is roughly 183 meters above sea level. Its deepest point is about 406 meters down. That places the deepest lake floor around 223 meters below sea level. So you can stand beside a freshwater lake deep in the continental interior, look across water sitting well above the ocean, and know the bottom is hundreds of meters beneath the ocean's reference level. Both elevations exist in the same lake. Fact 13. Canada ends on 18.5 hectares. Canada's southernmost piece of land is not a dramatic mainland cape. It is an Ontario island covering only about 18.5 hectares. Middle Island lies in Lake Erie and forms part of Point Pelee National Park. It sits slightly farther south than the mainland tip of Point Pelee, making this tiny offshore island Canada's southern land extreme. 18.5 hectares is less than 0.2 square kilometers. An entire country reaches its southern limit on something that small. Fact 12. A beach loss 79%. Point Pelee is protected as a national park. That does not mean the land itself stays in place. Measured beach area, there declined from about 82 hectares in 1931 to 17 hectares in 2017. That is a 79% reduction. Point Pelee is a dynamic sand and gravel spit, shaped by Lake Erie waves and sediment transport. Legal boundaries can stay fixed while coastlines move. More than 3/4 of the measured beach habitat vanished during that interval. Protection does not freeze geology. Fact 11. Scientists experiment on 58 lakes. In northwestern Ontario, scientists conduct experiments using entire lakes. The experimental lakes area contains 58 lakes dedicated to whole ecosystem research. Researchers can alter selected systems and compare them against untreated lakes, allowing them to watch effects emerge across food webs, water chemistry, and complete aquatic environments. A laboratory experiment usually fits on a bench. Here, the experimental unit can be an entire natural lake. 58 of them are part of the research landscape. That one is verified. Fact 10. Boats rise 19.8 meters. In Peterborough, boats can enter a chamber and rise 19.8 meters without climbing a conventional staircase of locks. The Peterborough lift lock uses 2 enormous water-filled caissons that counterbalance one another hydraulically. Add enough water to the upper chamber and its extra weight helps force the opposite chamber upward. The structure opened in 1904 and remains the world's highest hydraulic lift lock, almost 20 vertical meters in one movement. The machinery is more than a century old. Fact 9. Polar bears breed in Ontario. Ontario has breeding polar bears, not occasional animals wandering unusually far south, a recognized breeding population. The province identifies its southern Hudson Bay bears as the world's most southerly breeding polar bears, with historical provincial estimates around 900 to 1,000 animals. Ontario reaches far beyond Toronto's latitude, all the way to Hudson and James Bay, where coastal sea ice creates polar bear habitat. Vineyards exist in Ontario, so do breeding polar bears. The province is large enough for both. Fact 8. A mine beneath a lake. At Goderich, miners work roughly 548.64 meters, or 1,800 feet, beneath Lake Huron. The operation is identified as the world's largest underground salt mine. The shafts begin from shore, then workings extend beneath the lake bed into thick, ancient salt deposits. Picture the geometry carefully. There are miners underground. Above them is rock. Above that is the floor of Lake Huron. Above that is one of the largest freshwater bodies on Earth. This one sounds wrong. It isn't. Fact 7. A peatland bigger than countries. Northern Ontario forms part of a wetland system so large that different scientific boundary definitions still produce areas between roughly 320,000 and 372,000 square kilometers. The Hudson Bay lowlands are identified in peer-reviewed research as the world's second largest contiguous peatland complex. This is not one marsh. It is a continental-scale landscape of waterlogged soils, peat, rivers, forest, and coastal wetlands. Even the lower 320,000 square kilometer estimate puts the system on the scale of entire countries. Fact 6. An island bigger than nations. Manitoulin Island sits in freshwater. It covers roughly 2,766 square kilometers. That makes it the largest freshwater island on Earth. This is not a small wooded island with a dock and a cottage. Manitoulin contains communities, roads, forests, farms, and lakes of its own. It occupies a major piece of northern Lake Huron and helps divide the lake from the North Channel and Georgian Bay. An island does not need an ocean around it to become enormous. Fact 5. 1,000-year-old cliff trees. Some of Ontario's oldest living trees do not look ancient. They look barely alive. Eastern white cedars growing from cliffs along the Niagara Escarpment can exceed 1,000 years in age. Harsh conditions slow their growth so dramatically that small, twisted trees clinging to rock can contain centuries of annual rings. Size becomes a terrible guide to age. A giant forest tree may be younger than a stunted cedar growing from a crack in an Ontario cliff, more than a millennium in a few meters of wood. Fact 4. A lake in an island in a lake, U.S. Ontario has a lake on an island in a lake, and the inner lake covers about 106.2 square kilometers. Lake Manitou lies on Manitoulin Island, which itself sits in Lake Huron. Guinness recognizes Lake Manitou as the largest lake on an island in a lake. The nesting is literal. Lake Manitou. Inside Manitoulin Island. Inside Lake Huron. This sounds like one of those geography riddles that depends on creative wording. It does not. The inner lake alone covers more than 100 square kilometers. Fact 3. Sudbury through rock, 980 kilometers. About 1.85 billion years ago, the Sudbury impact launched materials so far that researchers have identified candidate ejecta roughly 980 kilometers from the structure. Other confirmed related deposits have been studied hundreds of kilometers away in Michigan. That means an impact in what is now Ontario threw shocked and melted material across a significant portion of the continent. Sudbury's surviving structure is already roughly 60 by 30 kilometers. Its debris field makes the event harder to comprehend. The geological evidence traveled almost 1,000 kilometers. Fact 2. Billion-year water still flows. At roughly 2.4 kilometers underground, in Ontario's Kidd Creek mine, researchers encountered fracture water, estimated to have remained isolated for about 1.1 to 1.8 billion years, not waterlocked as a tiny inclusion inside one crystal. Free-moving fluid coming from fractures in ancient rock. Scientists used geochemical isotope systems to estimate how long that water had been separated from near-surface circulation. At the high end, its isolation began long before complex animals existed, and Kidd Creek goes deeper. Fact 1. 2-billion-year-old water. Nearly 3 kilometers below Ontario, researchers found water whose age reaches into a range of roughly 1 to 2.2 billion years. Guinness records the Kidd Creek discovery as the oldest known non-meteoric water, using a headline age of approximately 2 billion years. The scientific dating is a range, not an exact birthday. That makes the result more precise, not less extraordinary. 2 billion years predates dinosaurs. It predates land plants. It predates complex animal life by an enormous margin. And the water remained isolated inside fractures in Ontario's ancient rock. Of everything on this list, that was the hardest number to accept. Every fact in this video is documented and sourced, including the ones that still feel geometrically or geologically wrong. For me, the hardest remains Kidd Creek, water from roughly 3 kilometers underground, with scientific age estimates reaching as high as 2.2 billion years. Which fact do you still find hardest to accept? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe for more verified geography where the real world keeps producing better material than fiction.